Morning, everybody. Welcome to Thursday's morning session for this year's Heidelberg Laureate Forum. I'm Raymond Seidel. I am the scientific director of Schloss Dagstuhl Leibniz Zentrum für Informatik, a long word, just say Dagstuhl, which is kind of the computer science equivalent of Oberwolfach. So some of you will know both, one, neither, well, now you should know both. Welcome. This morning has two parts, and the first one being a discussion about communication and crisis. Now, it was very impressive to come here this morning, because you can't see it. There's behind this wall, there's actually a group of about 20 people seeing to it that all the communication here in terms of microphones, recording lectures and panels and happens, and without you much noticing that all this stuff is happening. So first of all, I think we should give this team a big applause because this seems to be working flawlessly. Thank you. So now we're going to have a panel discussion, and Eva Wolfangel will moderate it. She is a scientific journalist and moderator. As it goes, and I'm supposed to say something good about her, and the first thing I can say, she has been to Dagstuhl. She actually came to a seminar that had to do with communication, and so we have actually kind of shared a bottle of wine, and she knows what she's doing, so I very much look forward for a moderation of this rather interesting, I think, important panel. So please, welcome, Frau Wolfangel.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Yeah, I think that's the best thing you can hear from people in computer science of a journalist. She knows what she's doing. I'm really proud of that, and I'm great. I'm happy to see you all here. I know it was a lot of organizing for all of you to arrive here in time with testing and everything, but I'm so grateful that we can meet up in person again and have all these discussions on stage and in between. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to discussing science, journalism, and communication today, because I think it became obvious during the pandemic that there is a problem, that we have a problem with trust in science and in the media. And I, as a science journalist, what I observe a lot, especially in the computer science area, that is a hesitation to communicate topics of the field as well as in mathematics. Topics often appear to be too complicated to be communicated to the general public. And on the other hand, the general public seems to be more and more skeptical about science. Yeah, and not to mention to communicate those topics critically from a journalistic perspective. But on the other side, these fields deal with many important topics, so they really deeply affect our lives. So it's all the more important to communicate them well and to help the public and the citizens to make responsible decisions about their future. So one challenge I observed in the field of computer science and machine learning, which is the topic I deal mostly with, is that those who can make serious contributions are not heard, or they don't want to speak up because they had maybe bad experience with being quoted wrongly in the press or things like that, or they fear this hype. This is around machine learning these times, for example. So the question is, how can the scientific community and science journalism help to counteract these trends that we lose trust of the public? How can we spark their interest, and how can we motivate them to be interested in topics of computer science and math, even if they seem to be complicated? But maybe they aren't. Maybe it's possible to break them down so that everyone can understand them. How can we deal with this trust issue? How can we regain trust? And most important for me today is to discuss possible positive examples. So what did you see out there? What did the panelists see out there of cutting-edge journalistic genres, styles, and methods to communicate these topics? So I hope that we will explore these questions in more detail in the next 90 minutes. After about half of the panel, we will have questions from the audience too. I will tell you more about this when we are closer to that point, but if you have any questions during the discussion, just write them down to remember them. And now I would like to introduce you my panelists. So we have Professor Eugenia Cheng. She's a mathematician and concert pianist, and I think many of you know her from her YouTube videos. They have been viewed over 15 million times to date. And it's all about math, so I think she's a great example to show that it's possible to communicate math with the broader public and to have fun with that. She's a scientist in residence at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She was granted tenure at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And she has previously taught at the universities of Cambridge, Chicago, and Nice, and holds a PhD in pure mathematics from the University of Cambridge. She does research in category theory and undergraduate teaching, and her aim is to get rid of the world of math phobia. She was an early pioneer of math on YouTube, as I said. I think 2007 was the first video she published. And she wrote a popular math book, How to Bake Pie, which is a title I really love a lot. Her second book, Beyond Infinity, was shortlisted for the Royal Society Science Book Prize in 2017. And her latest book, The Joy of Abstraction, will be published in October 2020, so next month. And she does amazing children's books, too, about infinity. So very warm welcome, Eugenia. So great to have you here. The next panelist I want to introduce is Jan LeCun. I think most of you know him already and saw him on the Hot Topic panel too. He has an ACM Turing Award 2018 for conceptual and engineering breakthroughs that have made deep neural networks a critical component of computing. In 2014, he was awarded with the IEEE Neural Network Pioneer Award. He's the chief AI scientist for Meta AI research, and he joined Meta in December 2013 when it was still called Facebook. He's also a Silver Professor at New York University on part-time basis, and he was the founding director of the NYU Center for Data Science. And he has been working in AI practically forever, so he joined Bell Labs in 1996, was then head of the image processing research department at AT&T Labs, and joined NYU as a professor in 2003. And since the late 1980s, he already has been working on deep learning methods, particularly on convolutional network model, which is the basis of many products everyone is dealing today with. So I think that's a good example for why these topics are really important for the broader public too, because it's just they are affecting our lives. Very warm welcome, Jan. Thanks a lot for joining us. The next panelist I want to introduce is Anna Maria Hartkopf. She is the project manager of MIP Labor. It's a research project for science journalism in the subject of mathematics, computer science, and physics at Freie Universität in Berlin, Free University. She's a mathematician, but she has a doctorate in science, communication, and mathematics. She has specialized in the communication of mathematics. She was a research assistant at the Mathematics Forschungsinstitut Oberwolfach. Sorry, I didn't translate that, but it's the pendant to Dagstuhl we had just for math. And she has been working as a math teacher in a Berlin comprehensive school. And in the collaborative research center Discretization in Geometric and Dynamics. And she is the editor of a recently published Handbook of Mathematical Science Communication, together with Erin Henning. So I think she's really our specialist in science communication around math, especially, and computer science maybe too. Very warm welcome, Anna. Great to have you here. And last but not least, I want to introduce you Anil Ananthaswamy. He's an award-winning journalist. He's a former staff writer and deputy news editor for New Scientist magazine. And he's a former MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellow, where we met 2 or 3 years ago already. And we had many discussions on the topics, on the intersection of AI, machine learning, neuroscience, and philosophy when we were together in Cambridge. And I realized how important these topics are, and at the same time, how much work we have to, or how much effort we have to put into these topics to convey them to the general public and to make clear why these things affect all our lives. Anil has been the journalist in residence at the Simon Institute at UC Berkeley, and he contributes regularly to Quantum Magazine, Scientific American, and other big science magazines and newspapers. And he's the author of 3 popular science books, The Edge of Physics, The Man Who Wasn't There, and Through Two Doors at Once, where he really explains physics and other topics in a great way, in a great and understandable way. And best news, he's currently writing a book on the mathematics of machine learning. Very warm welcome, Anil. So for the first round of this panel, I would like to ask you all a kind of a broad opening question, and it's great that you now are sitting in this order where I asked you to come to the stage. So I would like to keep just this order and ask you, so what is your experience? What did maybe go wrong with communication in journalism? How did we lose trust? And of course, most important, how can we do it better? Eugenia, maybe you want to start.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the Heidelberg Laureate Forum for inviting us here to talk about this important topic. I've had a very unusual career, as you may have discerned from the introduction. I was a normal tenured math professor until I wasn't. And I realized that I was not feeling fulfilled by that job, and I wasn't able to do the work that I really cared about, partly because it wasn't supported, but partly because it wasn't valued, by which I mean that communication, public communication, popularization, outreach in abstract mathematics was not in any way valued or supported in the university, in any of the universities I worked at, until I started working at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is an art school, and so everyone is studying art, but because it's an American liberal arts college, everyone has to study some of everything. And there I work part-time and have forged a mostly freelance career doing public speaking, writing books for general audience, writing a Wall Street Journal column, to bring abstract mathematics to a wider audience as a way of thinking. And what I believe that we need to do is a huge interconnected range of things, and I have 4 main points I would like to make. First of all, I think that we should make proper career paths for people who want to work in science communication. I don't think that I should have had to build a freelance career for myself, and I meet many young science undergraduates and graduate students who really want a career in science communication, and they ask me how to do it, what careers there are, and I say, well, unfortunately, I don't think there are enough of them. I believe that every science department, every maths department, and every computer science department should have a scientist there who is specifically there, at least for part of their job, to do communication, so that they can do communication of everybody's research in that department to a general audience. Perhaps it's a full-time role in science communication. Perhaps it's a research job that comes with part of its role. I don't know about the rest of Europe, but in the UK, every academic has to have administrative jobs as well, and it's usually things like admissions or director of teaching. But what if one of those was director of communication, and they understood every academic's research and then conveyed that beyond into the general public? Or a full-time job at the same level as tenured professors in communicating people's scientific research. And to back that up, I think we really need to improve general education in science and mathematics at all levels, beginning in primary school and all the way through undergraduate education, especially so that we don't just focus on proficiency and learning to be able to do things, but also so that people who can't necessarily produce their own science are still able to understand and follow scientific and mathematical arguments. Because unfortunately, I think we have made a dichotomy into people who can do it and then people who have nothing to do with it whatsoever. Whereas it should still be possible for even people who aren't going to become researchers, it is still extremely valuable and important for them to be able to understand the arguments and follow the arguments. And I think that it would be good to have more science communication courses at a university level, and also to have it simply embedded into every science class, so that everyone is required to learn how to write about science at different levels, both for children and also for their peers, and also at an expert level. And I think that my third point, I think that we really need to address to improve science communication is to improve inclusivity in the field. And I don't just mean the numbers and the numbers of different types of people. And we've all seen the big photo outside the front and the types of people who are in that photo at the front of this event. Because it's not just about diversity, but it's about the environment and how inclusive it is towards different types of people. And related to that, I think we really need to change attitudes about how important communication is and how we value it. Because one of the ways in which the field, I think, is not inclusive is that there is still such a strong attitude that being incomprehensible means that you are brilliant. And that therefore, if you are able to explain things in a comprehensible way, that somehow proves that you are not brilliant. And when I was a tenured professor, we had people in the department who said things like, in these exact words, being good at teaching proves that you are bad at research. That should not be the case. And it isn't the case, and we should know logically that that is not the case, and that we should value being able to bring more people in. Unfortunately, I think that some people still get their self-esteem from feeling that they can do something that nobody else can do, feeling that they can do something that many people can't do. And so if we bring more people into it, then we are ruining their self-esteem for them. Well, I think that many of us get our self-esteem actually from being able to explain things to people that they previously didn't understand. And in that way, we can bring more people in. And I think that having more of that valued at very high levels by prominent researchers, by institutions, and by the job market, and by careers, I think will really help with all our efforts at communication.
Thank you so much. Jan, what is your take on that?
Well, so I think I'm sort of wondering if really we are in a communication crisis. I think what we are in is a transition period where we now have means of communications that allow pretty much everyone to have a voice. And as a result, some of the voices we didn't hear before, now we hear. And some of those voices do not believe in science, for example, or other things. And what can carry information can also carry misinformation or disinformation. And I think as a society, we haven't yet learned how to deal with this new medium. Now, if we go back in history, excuse me, every time a new communication medium has appeared, there have been voices to claim that this new medium was going to destroy the fabric of society. And it's not just true of social networks today. It was true of the smartphones, of video games, of the internet, of TV, of cinema, radio, novel. You can go back to probably cave painting, and the elders of the tribe were probably telling the youngsters making those paintings, you're wasting your time. Why aren't you going hunting? So I think it's just we're in a transition period, and people, the public in general, is bombarded with all kinds of information without really having been used or trained to basically figure out which source of information are reliable. And so there are studies that show, for example, that people who are more likely to believe misinformation and click on false information and clickbaits are about 65 years old. And that's kind of a hopeful thing, because what it means is that most of you in the audience who are young, you grew up with the internet, and you tend to be much more able to figure out whether a source of information is good. And I think this is going to become better and better as we progress, as we figure out, what's the proper way to, for example, run a social network, which is a very difficult thing to do, and how can it be used for useful information. Now, there are phenomena that I think are extremely positive. The fact that today, anyone, anywhere in the world, can have access to scientific information directly from the scientists. You can go to arXiv and get the latest papers in computer science, mathematics, and physics. And it's bioRxiv for biology. You have scientists who make it a point of communicating directly with the public and are fairly active on Facebook, Twitter, and other social networks. And they will answer your questions sometimes. I do that. And I think the number of channels that scientists have to communicate is much wider than it used to be. So I'm very, very optimistic, actually, about the future. And I think we should have to learn how to use our new communication channels. There is a phenomenon also, which is that a lot of people from sort of younger generation have become pessimistic about the future because of things like climate change, because of regression of democracy in the world, for example, and new wars and things like this. There's however, interesting studies that show that, in general, for most people in the world, things have been getting better over time. There's a very interesting book by Steven Pinker about this. I disagree with him on many things, but I agree with him on this one, that things are getting better. And the general sort of pessimist view, I think, makes people distrust the process through which we've arrived at the situation that they interpret as being running into the ground or being negative, and that creates a distrust in science or in the scientific process. So I think we have to restore that trust by explaining what the process of science is, not necessarily claiming that science is always right, but showing that the sort of rational process of science is a way to sort of avoid to fool yourself and arrive at truth.
Thanks a lot for this optimistic perspective. Anna, what is your perspective on that?
I think my main point is that it's really important to look at science communication through a more scientific lens. And especially when we look at the science of science communication in general, we can see that mathematics, computer science, physics, so the more abstract sciences are not really covered. They focus mostly on life sciences. And on the other way around, when we look into people who do science communication and mathematics, they're mostly detached from what is the discourse and the research in science communication in general. And my aim is really to bring this together and to form something I'd like to call the science of mathematical science communication, and to really do research on that and to find out what works and what doesn't. And in the MEP Labor, it's this experimental research project, research laboratory we have at Freie Universität Berlin. We give out fellowships to science journalists and scientists who want to become science journalists, and then they have 6 months to a year to really dive deeply into a topic. Because I think that's point one. If you want to do abstract, we want to deal with a more abstract thing, you have to really have more time to understand it and to really need to talk to people several times and not just interview a scientist once. And then together we develop new formats of innovative science journalism. And this is one of the research questions we have, is like how to develop those formats. And we have set up a plan on how to do it, and this is more on the design science side of things. And then when those formats are done, then we do empirical research on if they're working or not. And this is our research approach. And also, I mean, this is the research side of the project, but on the other side, it is really practically supporting science journalism, which is going through a bit of a hard time. That we fund people for a stretch of time, and also like when they are done with working with the MEP Labor, they have become experts on topics, and then they can go on and write about it, and maybe, yeah, they hopefully learned a few things when they were with us. But one thing I really want to stress is, and I think this is something that we know from general science communication, is when the communication that comes out of the institution and science journalism get mixed up. This can create distrust, and I think we have to be a bit more careful there to see like who is doing the science communication and what is the objective behind it, and to really have more, we call it a sincere communication, and that could lead to more trust, in my opinion.
Sorry, just a quick question. So can you repeat what creates mistrust, when what happens, just to get it, understand it?
So generally one can see that the trust in science in a society is really high, and you can prove that by, you can ask people and they say that generally they trust scientists really a lot. And actually we can see that after Corona the trust in science has risen, at least in Germany. I know of a study that really shows it. Maybe just the people who distrusted became louder. So the distrust in science happens when there's other objectives getting into it. They get mixed up when you have politics, economy, or personal gain, like wanting to be a famous scientist. Something like this mixes into science. This is when the distrust happens. So science, they call it the bungee jump model, that the science itself stands on a rather high platform, and it might fall off when something else comes, but it will always get pulled back up.
And which is a sign for critical thinking of the public again, right? I think if it raises mistrust, if people do communication or communicate things, they have maybe private gains from that. It's totally fine to see that this raises mistrust or at least critical thinking. So yeah.
I mean, the approach of science is to be skeptical, and then why should the public not be skeptical? It's like it's good to have a skeptic public, maybe.
Great, thanks a lot. So, Anil, and what's your perspective on what did go wrong? What can we do better?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us on this panel. I mean, a lot of the things that all three of you have said already, I agree with, and there are probably subtle differences in how we parse these questions. I do think there is a crisis in terms of how the general public perceives science, but I'm not so sure it's a crisis of communicating the science itself. So there I kind of agree with you and you that the forces that are at play are quite complex. When it comes to something like communicating math, I think it has been actually very good over the last decade or 15 years. I mean, I think of books like Stephen Strogat's Infinite Powers, a book on calculus, that wouldn't have been written too long ago, and now publishers are willing to publish books with equations and the history of math. And one of my favorite set of math books is by a physicist at Stanford, Leonard Susskind. So Leonard Susskind is a cosmologist, a theoretical physicist who gave lectures at Stanford in the evening to the Silicon Valley professionals, because they came to him at some point saying that they wanted to understand physics in more detail than they could get by reading articles in, like, say, Scientific American or New Scientist and publications like that. So he started giving these lectures, which are essentially mathematical in nature. And those lectures led to these series of books called the Theoretical Minimum series. So I've looked at the first two of those books. One is the theoretical minimum amount of mathematics you need to understand classical mechanics, and the second one is the theoretical minimum math you need to understand quantum mechanics. And those are published by trade publisher. They're meant to be popular science books. They're not the traditional storytelling. He's not using any storytelling techniques. He's just telling you the story of the math itself. Very nicely done. So And then there's lots of material on YouTube, which I find astonishing these days when it comes to math. You know, Eugenia, your work, and then one of my favorite YouTube channels is 3 brown, 1 blue, or 1 blue, 3 brown. I forget what the actual combination is, but it's by someone called Grant Sanderson. Lovely visualizations that he uses to be able to explain things like linear algebra, calculus, differential equations. So the content is becoming more and more amazing. So this is just, I'm talking about just communication of complex ideas. My favorite kind of avenue for getting information about these complex ideas are actually podcasts. So, you know, the 3 podcasts that come to the top of my mind is Sean Carroll's Mindscape, which really delves deeply. Like, these can be 2-hour, 3-hour-long podcasts on very complex topics. There's a podcast called Brain Inspired, which sits at the intersection of computational neuroscience and AI. Again, Steven Strogatz has a podcast called The Joy of X, and probably the next one that I haven't heard yet called The Joy of Y. So the material is, you know, it's happening. But at the same time, I think there is a crisis, and that crisis is not necessarily happening because journalists and science communicators are not making an effort to communicate these complex ideas, but because I seriously think there are other forces at work that are very deliberately spreading misinformation. And this goes to what Jan was saying, that now we have the technology to spread this misinformation so fast and so widely that despite the best efforts of people trying to communicate these complex ideas, I think sometimes it feels like you're fighting a losing battle against institutionalized misinformation. And so individual journalists and individual science communicators have a very hard time keeping up with that. So we need an institutional response to the misinformation. And I personally don't know how one could engineer that, but we really need engineering solutions to tackle that. I mean, misinformation in science has always been there. I mean, you have to go back to the tobacco lobby's efforts over decades to, by planting scientists who generated papers to cast doubt on the idea that smoking is harmful. That happened and it took journalism, investigative journalism, to dig that out and make it clear that, okay, this was happening. And we see that now with climate change denial, right? And exactly the same process is at work. It happened with COVID for political reasons. I think the crisis is much more than communicators not being able to put their ideas out there clearly. It really does demand an institutional response. And what can regular media do? I think we really need to be. Well, first of all, I must slightly differentiate between, and Anna touched on this, but we need to separate out science communication from science journalism, right? And both science journalists and science communicators communicate the complex ideas in science to the general public, but journalists have an additional sort of task that they have to be doing, which is they are not on the side of scientists. They are literally on the side of the general public good. And defining the general public good is a difficult task, but there is an ethical responsibility that journalists have to not be too close to their sources, to be distant enough from their sources to see what they're writing about objectively. Again, we can have debates about what objectivity means and all of that, but science journalists are journalists and they communicate science. And science communication is fundamentally, whether it's PR firms or PR departments in universities or institutions or scientists themselves communicating directly to the public, that to me is science communication, and journalism kind of sits slightly outside of that, doing good science communication, but also playing the role of a watchdog. And that can be an adversarial relationship at times, and it needs to be, because like the case of the tobacco story, that if there were not adversarial journalists, or for climate change denial, if the journalists are not adversarial, these things are never going to come to light. So I think all of these things are at play, and maybe we can have a chat about our individual roles in all this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I see we have at least many more, but 2 topics that stand out, I think. One is the issue fake news and why do they get so much reach, and are they maybe even getting bigger, and as you said, forces that work against us, and in that area we are on the same team. And then we have this trust issue, which is a mixture of making sure that we stay in our roles and don't mix it up too much. And then we have this thing Eugenia touched around, is science or is math, in your case, is it too complicated to communicate, or is this maybe something scientists sometimes want to pretend that it's too complicated? And I heard a really interesting story in our preparation discussion from you, Eugenia, and I would like to ask you, because I think this story shows a lot about all these topics, about the clotted cream thing. Please tell the story.
It's kind of the story of how I got started in really going more mainstream with public communication, because as someone said, I started making YouTube videos in 2007, and that was about category theory. So I was really talking about abstract mathematics, and somehow those videos became really popular, at least relative to those days, because there were people all over the place who wanted to learn abstract mathematics, and they had no way to do it except then I started making these videos. And then I then started making videos for high school students to explain university level maths to interested high school students. And then someone at the university got in touch with me and said that a clotted cream company asked if I could do some maths related to clotted cream. And so I thought, well, that sounds fun. It's a fun way to say something fun about maths, because there's just not enough fun associated with maths out there. And so I did something that was to do with areas of circles and annuluses, and it was very basic maths that anyone in basically secondary school could understand, but it related it to something fun and tasty, literally tasty. And the thing is that you may not be aware, but there's this hundreds of years old rabid argument in the UK between Cornwall and Devon about which way up your clotted cream should go on a scone. And I can't even remember who says what, but one side, if anyone is from Cornwall or Devon here, they're going to start screaming at me. But one side says that the clotted cream should go first and then the jam. And the other side says, no, that's ridiculous. The jam should go first and then the clotted cream. No, who cares, right? Do what you like. But because the clotted cream company was from Cornwall, they just asked me to do it the Cornish way. So I did it the Cornish way, innocently. And then, of course, they put out a press release saying that a mathematician had proved that the Cornish way was better. I covered my back by writing an actual paper and putting it on my webpage, saying what I had done and making it quite clear that I had taken that as a basic assumption and not something that I had proved. They asked me to take it down from my webpage, which I obviously declined to do. But I did, so several things happened. One was a lot of people attacked me. So a lot of mathematicians attacked me for doing something fun, so for doing something they thought was trivial and that should be beneath a research mathematician. But at the same time, it captured the imagination of people all around the world, and it gave a lot of school teachers something that they could do with their pupils that was a bit more fun than usual about maths, that still had some, I was made sure that all the maths was correct. And I got interviewed around the world by about 20 radio stations and TV stations all around the world who wanted to talk to me about this, because of this apparent hook that I had apparently solved this angry debate between Cornwall and Devon. And so the thing is that part was wrong, but it enabled me to reach a wider audience, to talk about maths in some kind of fun way, which then enabled me, that was how I then got a contract to write a book entirely about maths and food. And then that led to my writing, my 8th book is coming out. And so it kind of launched that. So on the one hand, yes, it was stupid and it was wrong, but also it gave me a way to bring some fun maths to a wider public. And then some other food companies asked me to do some maths of their food, which I did, and it was always correct maths, but I still got attacked a lot by mathematicians who said that it was trivializing math, that basically they didn't want me to make it fun. And that's part of the problem with communication. If there are researchers who object when you make it fun, even when it's still correct, and then that you've given people a way into maths that is fun, if researchers are going to object to that, that's a really big problem, because that makes it look like maths is they want it to remain boring. And sometimes I feel that mathematicians do want maths to remain boring, and that this is a really big problem that we need to deal with.
And what I found really interesting about that story is that it was a great idea to make it really, easy, understandable, and it's a lot of fun to watch that video about clotted cream and scones, and you will get hungry when you watch it, I promise. But on the other hand, there was this big misunderstanding caused by the press department, right? Because they wrote something like, you proved that you should, whatever, put jam first or second.
Yes. And I think we can never stop, we can't stop people, I think it is a losing battle, as you say. We can't stop people putting misinformation out there, which is why I think the way to deal with it is by educating people better and by pointing out that now there is, as you say, so much information out there. The important thing is for us to learn how to tell what is good information. And I always think that that is one of the most important things about abstract maths, that abstract maths is thought of as being very removed from daily life. But it's about learning how to think clearly. And once we know how to think clearly, then we can think clearly about everything and discern what is good information or not. There's a wonderful TEDx talk by David Kung who says that if we teach maths and science from a point of view of authority, if we just teach it as the teacher says this and therefore it's right and you have to learn how to do it, then what we convey is that maths is handed down by authority. But maths is not handed down by authority. Maths is handed down by a logical framework, and science is handed down by a framework as well. But it can look like it has authority figures who we simply have to believe. And once we've conveyed that idea, then it's really bad, because we end up with a general public who seeks information from authority figures rather than a framework. And then they just pick who they want to believe, and then they just believe everything that that person says. And then we can't reason with them, because they're not using reason, they're using authority.
And I mean, in that case, the first problem that occurred with the press release, right? So maybe this could be a basic learning. Talk to your press department and stop them, or try to, no, don't stop them, but try to understand what their plan is, right? Because I think you said something like, okay, of course, they saw a story which is maybe people will click on or will read in the newspaper.
Cream company. That wasn't really anything they could do about that.
Okay, so that's that's out of your reach, I guess. Yeah, I mean, that's a great example for something else we discussed yesterday too, Jan, about a few years ago, I think there was. So how I remembered it when you said the first few words yesterday was there were two machine learning systems and they were talking to each other, and then they were starting to develop their own language. And what I then, up from that point, only heard in the public was, oh my God, they will take over the world. Now they have their own secret language. And that's the first step that everything goes really bad. And Jan, I think you know the story from the other perspective, from scientists, because I think it was a research from colleagues of you who published it. And this touches something you said. You said now it's easy for everyone to communicate and everyone can read papers on archive. And we reconstructed yesterday that this whole thing started because journalists were reading archive papers, right? And discovered that. And
yeah, so the story is, so this is work done by some of my colleagues at FAIR. I think it was in 2015 or something. And this is back in the days where a lot of journalists in the media did not quite understand the limitations of AI at that time. I think there's been a bit of education since then, but some progress. But it was still the time when, whenever an article was published about AI, there was a big, banner on the website on top of the article that basically showed a picture of the Terminator. Now we're kind of done with this. There's not much Terminator anymore. Maybe it's an avatar, Mark Zuckerberg or something. But what happened then is that it was research in emerging communication. So the experiment was they built two very simple agents. I can't say intelligent agents. They were really very, very simple, so particularly by today's standard. And they put those agents in a virtual environment where they had to basically solve a problem. And the problem was designed in such a way that the agents could not solve the problem in isolation. They had to collaborate. And those agents had been trained to use a communication channel that was basically English, okay, English words and sentences and syntax. And so the question was, if we put those two systems in this environment, will they spontaneously start communicating in English to solve that problem? And what they discovered was that the agent ended up solving the problem, and they ended up collaborating. But the type of communication they were using was using English words, but in a completely different way. So if one agent was telling the other one, move forward and turn right, it wouldn't be move forward and turn right. It would be table, table, chair, or something. They would invent basically a communication. Now the two agents were exactly identical, and you see this in the human species, that when you have two identical twins, they very often develop their own language, which is generally a dialect of their mother tongue. But it's incomprehensible to everybody else. And the reason they can do this is because their brains are wired the same way, more or less. And so there is an influence there, and they can understand each other with kind of a more efficient channel. So that's kind of what happens with those things. And so the experiment failed in a way because they wanted those systems to basically use English, and it wasn't in the end. So they stopped the experiment and they, did something else, and they wrote a paper about it. And some journalists, I think, read about it and maybe wrote an article that was kind of reasonable. But then another journalist in some tabloid kind of misinterpreted this and said some experiment gone horribly wrong, and there was a panic at the Facebook lab, and they had to stop the experiment because they thought it was going haywire. And you see those pictures from science fiction movies where the scientist kind of rips electronic cards out of the computer, and you see
and they still keep chatting and want to take over the world,
and blah blah blah, right? And it's just that they run the program, and it ended, and they didn't get the right result when they analyzed it. And that was it, right? So then my colleagues had to write. They were completely surprised by what happened, and they had to write a blog post to explain, it's not at all what you thought,
Those two are really good examples, those two stories from you and Eugenia, for things that were scientifically totally fine. Everything worked as it should, or experiment failed, but at least it was just science. And then it kind of blew up, and nobody knows how to stop this dynamics or how this...
May I say that it's kind of ironic that maybe Facebook became a victim of its own algorithms, because that's the kind of story that would do really well on a clickbaity kind of newsfeed, right? No?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think this is how I heard about this. This was via Facebook or Twitter, and this algorithms, of course, I only got it because everybody was, the algorithm thought, oh, this might be interesting because many people discuss it, and that's...
But this is fake news. So in the sense that you talk about the Facebook algorithm, it's true that prior to maybe 2015, there was a lot of clickbait on Facebook, and there was ranking algorithms that would create information bubble and something like this. That got changed over the time because you learn about the effect of a new service on society that you couldn't predict, and then you sort of correct the algorithm. In 2018, there was a complete early 2018, late 2017. The ranking method used by Facebook was completely overhauled. In 2016, clickbait completely disappeared because the economic model for it was basically destroyed. So there was no economic incentive for people to publish clickbait on Facebook. And then
you still see. I mean, clickbait's still a huge problem, isn't it?
Not on Facebook, no.
I mean, I think we can agree on that. It's a mixture of, I think, algorithms, of course, of social media. That I mean, there was a study by MIT a few years ago that showed, right, that these algorithms amplify polarizing news, and those are often polarizing headlines.
Here. Okay, so I would encourage you to look for, there's a long list that was put together by social scientists that do research on the effect of new communication technology and social networks in particular on political polarization. And there's a number of questions as to whether the more use of social networks sort of improves. And when you look at serious scholarly work on this, it's basically half and half, so or a third. So there is a third that says, yes, we see an effect that use of social network increases polarization. Other that say we didn't detect any effect, and other that says actually it makes people less polarized. So, for example, there was some work by some of my colleagues at NYU who are political scientists, and they paid people in Croatia, I believe, or in Bosnia, before the anniversary of the Srebrenica massacres. So this is kind of ethnic rivalry, and they paid people to not use Facebook for a few months, and then they measured how polarized they were, or ethnically rival they were before and after the period, and there was a control group, of course. And what they realized is that people who stayed on Facebook actually were less polarized in the end. And so it really depends, and that's like, you know, a causal experiment where you do intervention. There's also a lot of study by Matt Grengskow at Stanford. He's an economist also, and he's tried to figure out a lot of factors that cause the increase of political polarization in certain countries. So there's certainly an increase in polarization in the US. There's been one in the UK, particularly around Brexit, to some extent in France in sort of recent years, but not that big. And then in countries like Germany, it's actually gone down, and Denmark has gone down. So they all use social networks. And so if you want to look for a cause for increasing polarization, it's not social networks, it's something else. We don't know what.
All I was saying is that people still want clicks. And so the trouble, one of the problems is that people just want clicks on the articles. It doesn't matter if the article is true or not. In fact, it's probably better if it's not, because it will increase more clicks. And it's the same with all of writing and with books. And one of the most famous examples is Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, which has sold N billion copies. But how many people have actually read it? And how many people have actually understood it and will admit that they don't understand it? Okay, me. So I've tried to read it 3 times. I tried to read it when I was a teenager. I tried to read it when I was an undergraduate, when I was a postgrad, and I tried to read it a couple of years ago. And I can't get past about page 3 because I just don't understand any of it. And I'm a mathematician. And so anyone out there who says that they understand it, well, I don't know. We think maybe it's the most unread book. But of course, the publishers are delighted because they've sold billions of, or millions, or something. I'm exaggerating. I'm being clickbaity myself now. But they've sold millions of copies. And so at some level, there's 2 different things going on. Some people just want to make loads of money by selling loads of books. Some people want just to get loads of eyes on their articles, and it doesn't matter whether the article has any truth in it or not. They just want people to click on it. And so I think we need to do education behind that, so that regardless of whether it's true or not, people are equipped to be able to tell for themselves, so that even if it has been clickbait, they can still tell.
And I mean, the article itself still can be way more nuanced than the headline often is, right? And then there's, I think, another effect, because I still tend to think journalists who scan archive papers or who look through archive papers for interesting topics, they have kind of, they should be quite advanced, right? I only know Anil who is doing that because he told us yesterday. So, and I think they have some feeling of responsibility. So I don't think that they see, oh wow, there is some, okay, that's not an important experiment and it failed and nothing happened, but we really want to make it as a dangerous thing. I think I can think that this is their goal. Yeah, maybe Anil, what is your perspective?
I think we probably need to talk about this tendency in both science communication from PR departments and from journalistic sources, that everything needs to be a story. That there is, and stories are important. That's how we communicate ideas and get people engaged in what is being discussed. But this sort of unrelenting focus on wanting everything to be a story somehow ends up kind of moving us towards the sensationalist elements of whatever is being discussed. And we oftentimes forget, especially in journalistic circles, to think clearly about the exposition that is needed to explain the science and the math and whatever it is that you're writing about. So in the service of the story, we tend to lose sort of the aspects that really will go a long way towards educating the public. So when Jan was talking about how in 2015, journalists didn't know too much about AI, and that had consequences. And I remember that era because we were all in that boat at the time as journalists. And part of the problem there is that media outlets don't want to get into the weeds, and they just want to stay at the level of, I sometimes derogatorily call it entertainment, and it's not exactly that, but you know what I'm saying. It's basically they want to keep the audience engaged, and are not willing to get stuck into sort of the details that may make for a little bit of difficult reading, but I think it's necessary. Over time, you have to build up this sort of base of knowledge that there's a lovely quote by Tim Radford, who was the science editor of The Guardian. He had written a very nice, he called it 25 Commandments for the Scientific Scribe or something like that. And one of the commandments was basically saying that, look, you know, journalists, the classic error in journalism, and I think in most communication, is that we overestimate how much the audience knows, and then hence your writing can be basically written at a level where you make too much assumptions about what the audience knows. But you always, the other classic error that writers make is underestimating the intelligence of the audience. So basically they become patronizing towards the audience. So somehow not overestimating what the audience knows so that you're willing to then, you know, talk about it, but then never underestimating that they will actually understand what you're saying if you do your job right, you know, and write well or communicate well. So I feel like science media, whatever form, whether, you know, communication or journalism, has a responsibility to start really taking the details seriously. And stories, you can still tell stories. Stories don't have to be about personalities or people. Stories can be about ideas. And there are narrative devices that just run solely on the notion that ideas are themselves attractive to readers and to the audience. And so if we keep that in mind as communicators, I think that will go a long way towards addressing some of these concerns.
I think that's a great point, because often the story that can be associated with abstract mathematics is of some weird guy who's been sitting in a dark room for 10 years and has no friends, and then emerges at the end and solves some hundreds of years old standing problem. And this perpetuates the idea that to be a mathematician, you have to be very strange and have no social life. And this is something that's perpetuated by the media and by Hollywood and by fiction, because because people are attracted to stories about people. And I think that conveying stories about ideas is a wonderful thing to do.
And what you just said leads nicely to something else we discussed previously in the preparation discussion, is about communicating uncertainty, because that we underestimate what did you say, the ability of the audience, right, or this
I think that's really important. And again, I think all of us on the panel would agree that one of the things that is a problem when we're communicating science is that we don't focus enough on communicating the uncertainty inherent in the process of doing science, and it's that uncertainty and the feeling of not knowing something that drives scientists to do what they do, that drives mathematicians, like Eugenia, you were talking yesterday, that drives you to do the math that you do. And unfortunately, this gets somehow washed out especially in journalism. We don't spend enough time communicating this idea that the whole process of science is inherently at the edge of uncertainty, because that's where the work is happening. And so if you ask a scientist, are you 100% sure about this? An honest scientist will say no. And there's nothing wrong in saying that. And the scientists should feel free to say that. And the people should be, you know, who are reading and listening to all this should understand that that is the way things happen. And there is an amount of scientific fact that can be considered, you know, figured out and true in whatever context that is. But then there is a body of work that remains at that edge of uncertainty, and we need to start communicating that much more so that people get comfortable with that. And then we don't have these crazy headlines saying, you know, cancer has been cured, or because no scientist was going to say that.
Or coffee causes cancer, or coffee cures cancer, one day or the other. Because scientific truth, as you say, isn't actually, it's not true. It's true within the context of science, right, within a framework. And it's the same with mathematical truth. It's not true. It's true within a framework that has been set up to be testable in certain ways and to self-correct as well, so that when scientific truth is established, it's established with a certain amount of uncertainty built in. And then if more evidence comes along, then it corrects itself, which doesn't mean that the previous thing was untrue, because that uncertainty was already built into it. But we've done a very bad job as educators, I think, of educating everyone about what that uncertainty is. And that if you're not, some people think that if you're not 100% sure of something, then it's just a theory. And then there's this idea that anybody's theory is equally valid. And so a random person comes up with a theory about how to cure COVID, and that's supposedly equally valid because the scientists aren't sure either, and because the vaccines don't work 100%, they think it means that it doesn't work. So we've got this awful black and white view among non-scientists that things are either black or white, but really everything is grey. It's just about where in the grey they are. And being 95% certain of something isn't the same as just making something up off the top of your head because you feel like it. I think we've done a very bad job of
I've learned an interesting new word from you, Anna, yesterday about this, what is it called? The deficit model. I think this connects to scientists and maybe journalists not trusting the public to be able to understand the concept of uncertainty. Did you meet that in your research on the science communication? So what is this deficit model? What does it lead to?
Yeah, it's the basic assumption that if there's a problem between science and society, then the fault of it is always on the science of society, and that society is somehow lacking something that can be understanding, that can be appreciation. Now it's a bit that it's trust that's lacking.
Yeah.
We can always, like, science looks at the public and it's just like, you were doing something wrong. And I think this basically then a deficit, and it was, first the idea was just to pour out more knowledge, and then came along all those advertisements of science is cool, science is fun, and now there's like a demand for science, for trust, basically. But I think it would be a good idea to really look at where's the trust, where is it lost, and how to regain it. And I think also trust, it kind of, and this is a dilemma, and I think it's especially a dilemma because what you said, Anil, that there are forces who are actively launching fake news, and there's a misinformation campaigns that are really actively working. But I think if science really wants the trust of the public, then the approach somehow, and this is a very vulnerable situation. You have to go to the public and say, like, we trust you to make your own opinion on that. And this is something that I think every scientist is like, no, because I know what it is like. But it's like, no, I can inform you. We can talk, and then but I have to trust you that you are able to make your own opinion. And this is uncomfortable, I think, but I think this is the way that the trust can actually be built.
So do you think the big fear of people, the people don't understand uncertainty, and so that's what I heard often from scientists. So if we tell them the truth, that this is really, this is not the truth, it's just, means uncertainty, then they will say even more, okay, this is just opinion, scientists don't really know. Is this big fear, is it, so it's not, I guess it's not helpful, but are you sure that it doesn't cause problems if we communicate uncertainty much more openly?
Yeah, no, it will, yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to solve it, but it's. And I think, but I think it's like that's what Eugenia said, that when you have like within the realm of science, we know how truth is established, and we need to really think of if we go then into another sphere like the public or politics, then truth is a different concept, and we have to somehow see how it works there, and then talk. I think the dialogue is basically the only thing, and the dialogue means like why is there nobody from the general public sitting on this panel, right? so it has to be a dialogue with society and with the public, and in this dialogue there's like the establishment of knowledge.
Yes, and if we overstate how much we know something, then we ruin trust very quickly. Yeah. And so if someone is worried about something and you say to them, it's going to be fine, well then how do you know it's going to be fine? You don't know it's going to be fine, and so then you lose their trust. And so it's like if a child says that they're afraid of a monster under their bed, and you say, there is no monster under your bed, but if there is, I'll fight it, then you lose their trust, because it sounds like you said something that you were overly sure about, and then you open yourself up to being shown to be not sure about it. And so if scientists try to address the fear of uncertainty by saying, actually, no, we're completely sure about this, then it makes it worse, because it can easily be shown that we're not completely sure about it, and then And then that's one reason that we lose trust.
If you stay in that picture, how should we talk about the monster under the bed? Is that we think we are 95% sure that there's no monster, or how should we do it?
That would be a great thing to do. Then we could start teaching children how to deal with uncertainty.
And then we could say, and statistics.
Well, so how come? And then let's try and gather evidence about whether there's monster under the bed. Let's look under the bed, and then maybe there is a monster under the bed, and we'll adjust our statistics. And so I think that we should talk more about that in education at a very early stage, so that everybody gets used to it from a very early stage. And I think one problem with science and maths education definitely is that too many people think, oh, that's too difficult for children. We can't talk about that with children because it's too difficult. But if you wait until it's not too difficult, it's too late. And so I have a couple of children's books out, and quite often the adults say to me, oh, I gave this book to my child and they really liked it. I didn't understand it. And the adults are really afraid of the fact that they didn't understand it. And I'm always trying to say, look, it's fine not to understand it. In fact, mathematicians don't understand it. We don't understand anything all the time. We spend our whole lives not understanding anything, especially in research talks where none of us understands anything. We still carry on going to them, but that's a slightly different topic. But as Anil was saying, we don't sit comfortably with not understanding it, but we also don't run away from it. We kind of run into it. And it's what drives us to do research, to find out more things. Whereas I think a lot of people get put off maths because they think, oh, well, I don't understand it, so I'm not good at it. And then in school, some people loudly declare that they find it easy and they've understood everything. And that puts off the people who still have questions and who feel that they don't understand it. Whereas really, you can't understand it at school. There are so many things at school that you can't possibly understand because they depend on something else. Like if you do recurring decimals, you can't understand that unless you've done calculus, because it actually doesn't make any sense until you've done calculus. So people who think that they understand that 0.9 recurring equals 1 at school, they look like the ones who are good at maths and they get celebrated. But actually they're just deluded because they don't understand it, because it requires calculus. So the people who feel that they don't understand it and feel that it doesn't really make sense, they're actually the ones who are right and should be encouraged. But somehow we encourage people who are very sure that they've understood it and got it all right. And the education system's gone really wrong like that, because then you get full marks and you move on to the next thing. And the whole point is to get everything right as fast as possible and get full marks and move on, rather than to find the things you don't understand, celebrate the possibility and the potential to discover more, and then go into it.
That's such a relief to hear that from you, that it's just, you don't have to understand. And I guess it's relieving for everyone in the room, because I think you know the situations where you think you don't understand things and you shouldn't tell anyone about that. And yeah, it's so important that you say that. Thank you so much. Since there's only half an hour left, I would like to move to the question from the audience part. And we have thought about something special, how we do that. So I would like to send the panelists down to the audience, not to answer the questions, but to collect your questions. So if you have a question, those 4 people will now go through the room. Tell them your question, they will bring it to the stage, and then we will discuss the questions here. This is due to make everything more inclusive, so that, for example, shy people are able to ask questions who would maybe never go to a microphone. So really, please don't be shy, because those are nice people. You saw them now here. Give them your questions. Yeah, I think you can go over here and grab a pen and a paper to collect them. Please be back in about 2 or 3 minutes by the latest, maybe even 1. Collect as many questions as you can. The reason why I ask them to be back quickly is because I have to stay on stage. That's what they told me in this room full of people back there. Because for the remote audience, it's not totally nice now to have this empty stage. So I have to stay here and tell you nice things. I'm really happy to see so many hands. I think we will have a ton of questions. Maybe we even have to make the coffee break shorter, or we can discuss the remaining questions during the coffee break. Yeah, I think so far we had really interesting and diverse topics on the panel too. I think what we have maybe to discuss, maybe in the coffee break or the next few years at HLF, is Eugenia's suggestion to have proper career path in science communication. And I was really shocked by this notion that some people think if you are good in communication, you cannot be good in research. I think Eugenia shows us that this the opposite is the case. I think she's just really brilliant in both areas. We heard Jan, who said there's no crisis, it's rather a transition phase. I just go on talking, right, until they come back. Is that good? Oh, I see it works totally fine with the questions. Just tell them your questions. Don't talk too much, because I need them back on stage soon. In the meantime, I'm going to talk a bit more about what we have heard so far, just to keep that in our minds. We had Anna, who told us that it creates distrust if we mix our roles, and I think this is really important, because this is something I hear quite often in this scientific conferences, that the idea is that we are all in the same boat, and this is not always the case. So we as journalists have another role than science communicators, than scientists. Anil said something nice yesterday. He said, we are not in the same team, and we as science journalists, we are for science, but we are not for scientists. So our role is always to assess things critically, and yeah, I think this is important not to lose even more trust. So I see there are some more hands, and then I really hope to have you back soon here. It's great to see so many questions in the audience. It's really cool. Another thing that made me really hopeful was Jan's observation that the younger generation is much more critical when it comes to the internet, news on social media, so that critical thinking is growing with maybe experience being grown up with the internet. And of course, because with this age that everyone can communicate, there's a growing demand on our critical thinking to decide what is a source I can trust and what is not trustworthy. And I think this is a solution for many of the problems we discussed today. So now I think really 3 minutes are over, and I hope to get my panelists back on stage now. I think there's one last question. Okay, they really want to have all your questions, I see, and that's cool. I like that. It's really real interaction here in the audience today. So, welcome back. I mean, maybe we have to serve coffee in the room, which is probably not allowed. Maybe have 1 hour more. Okay, maybe you start. Anil, I need you back now. Sorry. Thank you so much. Wow, that's really, I'm so grateful that the audience is so interactive and obviously listened and thought a lot about the things. Anna said she has a great question, so let's just start with yours.
Yeah, this is a question, I guess, to you science journalists, and it's like, why should a scientist trust a journalist? So how to establish a trust between journalists and scientists? The working.
I have opinion on that, but I'm the moderator, so maybe it's yours.
So how do we establish trust between public and journalists?
No, the scientist and the journalist.
Why
so
should
if you go to a scientist and talk to them, why should they trust you?
Take their time to talk to you.
Why should they trust you?
Yeah.
Oh, and trust, yeah.
Why should they trust you? So Jan, I'm a journalist. I come to you as someone who's an expert in AI. Why should you trust me?
Why did you? Because I know that.
Or why did you trust me when I came to you?
Because before you contact me, you point me to things you've written before, and I can see if it made sense and I liked it. But I have a couple of horror stories, being interviewed by a journalist who apparently did a really good job before, and then for the article in question, the result of the article had nothing to do with the content that I was talking about, because there was some sort of... So I think I take an attitude about life, which is I don't make assumptions of ill intent, but sometimes people have an agenda and they don't tell you.
I think this speaks to the broader question of how do you build trust, and trust is not. You cannot assume trust when you're starting off, right? You have to build trust. So for a journalist, for instance, the relationship with the journalist and the general public, that trust is built upon the fact that you, as a journalist, have integrity. That there is a certain level of integrity that you bring to the process of doing your journalism that over time establishes trust with the people. So when the general public starts looking at your articles over time, they hopefully will develop trust with that particular media outlet or the particular journalist. And I think the same thing probably goes for trust between journalists and the scientists that they're speaking to. So like Jan said, you could have done 10 years of good work, and you can undo that with one article that betrays that trust, right, with the public or with the scientists. So it's a constant. I wouldn't say struggle, but it's something you have to be always aware of as a journalist, that this is not to be taken for granted. Trust is earned, and you have to keep working at it.
Another thing, because this sounds a bit like you really look for really concrete ideas and tips. So what I tell people, what you said, Jan, is if you're approached by a journalist, first thing is really be open and assume that they are really nice people. Second thing is check what their previous work, and then you have an idea what they did so far. That helps a lot. And one additional thing you can do, at least in Germany, I don't know how it's in the US, but in Germany, you can ask to see your quotes. So we normally don't send whole articles, but you can ask to see your quotes before they get published. And I think from my perspective, that's totally fine, because I know that there are so many misunderstandings, and especially when it comes to complex topics. And the question, why should I talk to journalists, is really because in the end, it's the public. You are working for the public. So I think it's your responsibility to communicate your work to the public, and it's in your interest too, because in the end, the public decides via elections if you get well funded in the future. And I think we all saw that this can go wrong in the US. So I think these are the things you have to consider should consider when a journalist approaches you. So sorry, but I'm the moderator. Back to my role now. Who else?
I have a couple of questions that people ask that speak to the same issue. I think we can, and it has to do with the notions of inclusivity and diversity that we brought up. So this is basically, people felt. A couple of questioners felt that most of the things we've been talking about kind of applied to Western Europe and North America and potentially English language. So the question is, when it comes to communicating science in local languages with media that is probably more traditional, like newspapers, or in places where the setup is not as mature, how do we tackle these very same questions of communicating science and being science journalists? And so I would love to, I'm posing the question.
Who wants?
I'm not sure I understood the question, because I think there are big problems with the colonialism and the European influence on mathematics and science, but I'm not sure if it's how it makes a difference that you have to write an article in a different language. I thought it was going to go in a different direction, about conveying the Eurocentric domination of how we have set up these cultures in the first place, and how we push the fact that the scientific framework is a good one for progress, except that this is the progress that has caused the destruction of the environment and the world that we depend on, and that maybe the cultures that did not use that framework for science had a much better, more stable relationship with the environment and did not destroy the environment, and that we shouldn't present ourselves as being better than that. But I don't think that was the question. I just answered a different one, like a politician.
Yeah, the way I understand it is, and I can relate to some of this question because I teach science journalism in India, and this question comes up, like how do the local languages communicate science to people who are only reading about it in the local languages? And it's a tough question, because the media in a particular language may not be doing as much science communication, and much of the higher education in science happens in English. So it's already predisposed to communicating ideas in English. And there has to be a very specific effort in local language media, and by people who are scientists who are well versed in English and of course in the language that they want to communicate in. And it's not an easy solution. There's no kind of package solution that one can suggest. But I've seen efforts in local media where it starts with things like translating things that are happening or have been communicated in English into local languages. But I think it's a process where the media in the local language then starts getting mature enough to have their own journalists go and do the necessary reporting and writing in the language that they're using. So I think it's going to take a while. It's a complex process, but I can see that these things are beginning to happen in regional languages. I know that it's happening in India, and I would imagine for instance, I think one of the questioners was potentially from a Spanish-speaking country. So I think it's beginning to happen there. So I don't have a sort of universal solution to suggest here.
Well, I think there is a universal solution. It's automatic translation, and it's happening. And it's going to happen. I mean, 10 years from now, we won't be seeing this as a problem anymore.
So the Babel fish.
Yeah, basically. I mean, the technology pretty much exists already. It's not perfect, but it's getting better by the day. And I mean, you already see it, right? You can watch a video on YouTube and you got subtitles in whatever language you want. No, it's not. You don't yet have translations in sort of local dialects. One of the few thousand local dialects in India, but currently it's a few hundred languages already, and it's only going to get better.
Right.
But still,
Pretty interesting related question that someone asked me,
yeah.
Which was, if we say that math is important for everyone, is that snobbish? Which I think is a really interesting question, because usually I think snobism is the opposite. It's saying that things are not for everyone and that we're going to keep this for ourselves. But I think I can see what this is about. It's saying, should we push math and science onto everybody in this way? And I think that's an important question for us to consider. And what I always say is that it's not that I think everyone needs it. I would never say everyone needs it. And I don't think everyone should understand these things. The only thing I wish everyone would understand is love and generosity and kindness and trying to do something about inequality. But I just think that we should stop keeping people out. That's what it's about. It's about letting people in. It's not about forcing people in. It's not about telling them they have to, but it's making sure that we let people in. And relatedly, someone said, how can maths teach about critical thinking, or as I like to call it, thinking, given that mathematicians have their own beliefs? And I think it's really important to remember that we have a framework, and it doesn't mean that we don't have beliefs, because all logical systems start with some basic axioms and then we build from that, and that we should acknowledge that we all have basic axioms. The question is what our basic axioms are, and then how we develop our beliefs using logic from those basic axioms. So I don't think that thinking is mutually exclusive from having beliefs.
I want to add something to the first question. You said if we need to push math on the people or keeping people out, but I think math, everybody's doing math.
Yes,
already.
But some people even object to that concept, and I find it hard to understand, but I have seen it said that declaring that everyone is doing math is itself sort of snobbish, because it's like claiming that maths, some people think that claiming that math is everywhere is bad, because it no, I can't reconstruct the argument.
Yeah, I would be very interested in that argument.
I can't quite reconstruct it. Well, some people object because they don't want everyone to be doing math. But some people object because because they think we shouldn't be enforcing that framework on other people, and that we shouldn't be saying that we shouldn't be claiming that it's only valuable because of that. Because, for example, if a native culture understands something that is not any way to do with the framework of Eurocentric mathematics, but they've done something and that we can then interpret it Eurocentrically as mathematics, then it's kind of patronizing to say, oh, but this is great, it's also maths. I think that's what the point is.
I see.
But it would be even more patronizing to say, well, you have other problems, don't care about math, right? Yeah, but it's interesting, yeah, that it seems like the idea that, and maybe it is, right? Science and scientific thinking is a luxurious thing that everybody can afford. But yeah, so really interesting.
You have some, because I have some other interesting questions I would love to address.
I have a related one here, which is perhaps the style of mathematics education and the fact that it's used as kind of a selection mechanism at school in many countries makes people afraid of math. And simultaneously also a lot of people, perhaps as a result of this, don't understand how important math is in modern society. Like there is an incredible amount of math that goes into this. Everybody uses it, right?
But I'd also like to stress that many people understand that it is important in all of that technology, but that doesn't mean they need to understand it, right? I don't understand the math inside my phone, I still use it. And so that enables people to say, well, I'm glad someone understands math, but I still don't have to do it myself. And so what I try to say is that it's not just about direct applications, it's about learning how to use your brain well. And I hope that all people want to use their brain well. It may seem to us that not everyone thinks at all, but still, if we present it as a way to use your brain well, aside from the direct applications, I think that's really important, because too often we push how important all these amazing technological inventions are, and there's two problems. One is we're destroying the world, and the other one is that alienates people who aren't going to be engineers or scientists or doctors or any of the things that use maths. So showing that it's a way of thinking clearly, I think, is really important, and this relates to a question someone asked about how we can incentivize science to be ethical. And as a related question, is there some way that we could make impact factors about public engagement? So we have impact factors about scientific journals and the amount of citations that we have. Could we introduce some kind of impact factor measurement for public engagement and make that part of a promotion process, and also incentivize ethical research or disincentivize unethical research? And there's part of me that is very wary of impact factors because they're so black and white, they're so crude as a measure. And how can we measure how much public engagement? And then once you have a measure, it's very easy to manipulate those measures, and then is that really what we want? And in terms of disincentivizing unethical scientific research, well, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the entire system of competition is one of the things that incentivizes people to do things fast and possibly be less ethical in order to be the first person to do something, rather than to collaborate with everyone and do it well and slowly. But what does everyone else think?
What is the solution for that? Yeah, do you have ideas about that? Yeah, others?
I mean, I think making less competitive.
I think there is an interesting question about like the importance of scientific culture, for example, when it comes to climate change. So there was, we're in Germany, the Green Party was born in Germany, and basically caused Germany to abandon its nuclear power program in the 1970s, or to at least scale it down and to abandon it more recently. And it turns out it would have been the best technology to actually correct climate change. This is the best zero emission technology that we have to produce energy. And so sometimes, unless you know the sort of details of the underlying science, and you have some foresight, you can make the wrong choices that you think are ethical but turn out to be destructive. And Germany is the perfect example of this, in terms of like wrong political choices pushed by basically anti-science and technology attitudes. So we're going to be careful what we think. We're talking about uncertainty. We really have to sort of convey that message to the public. And it always becomes very polarized when there is debates about those questions, unfortunately. Yeah.
But this comes back basically to the thing, communicating uncertainty. That is, science is not about the truth. It's about what we know so far. And of course, there's always two sides of everything, right? I think this is again for that we and you, and I have to stop saying we to everything, but we and you should just really be honest and not think of people won't understand it, or they will get the wrong conclusions if I tell them what is.
And on being honest, someone asked me how we can convey the human experience of doing mathematics and science better. And I think that's really important, because on the one hand, the whole point about mathematics and science is that it doesn't depend on humans. The authority doesn't come from the fact that it was some famous person who said it. It comes from the fact that we used a framework and a process. But it's still a human process, right? It's still a human experience doing it. And I think I agree with whoever asked me this. It's really important to convey what that human experience is like, so that people can learn how to do it as a human experience. But it can feel very vulnerable, and to admit what the human experience is like. That the human experience of doing mathematics research is that you spend your whole life feeling incredibly stupid because you don't understand anything at all. And that you spend 3 months looking at one sentence in a paper and you don't understand it. And then you come back 10 years later to the same sentence and you still don't understand it. And that you sit through research talks, you don't understand a thing and you're lost after 2 minutes. Or that you're frantically using Wikipedia to look words up that they didn't explain because you're too scared to ask, because then you'll admit that you can't remember what those words mean. And that we are still vulnerable to admitting these things, because it's not that we have invented this in our head, but people tell us that we're stupid for not knowing those things. And they're still waiting to laugh at us for not knowing what this word means. And so I think it's really important for people who have power and who feel secure and who feel stable in their position to stand up and say these things and admit that they didn't understand that book and that they didn't understand this talk. And Anna, you were saying yesterday that maybe that's your story, you should tell it if you want to, but that privately we admit to our friends over drinks afterwards that we didn't understand anything in any of those talks.
Or maybe tell that story if you want to.
This is the story of the generic math professor who told me the story that he and his colleagues have a secret sign they give each other when they're not understanding anything in the talk, and that happens really early. And there was
after 5 or even 3 minutes, right?
Yeah,
the first people have to use that sign.
Not even in a research talk.
In a talk. But he told us to us and a bunch of PhD students standing around, and you could see all the faces lit up, and everybody was just feeling, oh, it's not me, it's not. And I think this is just so important. This feeling of, oh, it's not just me, and then you relax, right?
Is to change that as a normal situation.
Yeah,
why do we just all accept that we don't understand anything 3 minutes into a talk? We should actually change it so that we do understand things during a talk.
There's a question for someone here who asked, how do we reach people who are not into science? They just don't have any interest in it, but yet they probably need to know something about it because they see society depending on technology, and perhaps they feel abandoned by the progress that they don't understand, and they end up rebelling or not trusting science or lose trust in the whole process. So how do we reach people?
I have a lot of experience of this because I teach art students, and most of them feel completely put off by maths and science from their past education. So one thing is to acknowledge that they are traumatized by their past education. It's not just that they're uninterested, they've been actively traumatized by what happened to them in the past. So I take care to validate them for that and to agree that what happened to them in the past was terrible and it was traumatizing, that it doesn't have to be like that. But the other thing is that they have been alienated by mathematics because they don't think that it addresses any of the issues that they care about the most, which are to do with injustice, social justice, politics, questions of equality. And so I use abstract mathematics to address those questions. And then they become interested because they see that actually mathematics can address the questions that they care about. And that's how I do it.
I have one question I really want to ask, because it is a person I had to insist a little bit to get a question. So that's why I want to ask it. And this is maybe for you, Eugenia, is like how to tips on for all those young scientists here on how to communicate their science better, where to start, how to do it.
Friends. I love talking to my friends at parties about what I do, and people in completely different fields, and that's why it's wonderful to be in a place where you can talk to people who are in totally different fields. One of the things I loved about doing my PhD in Cambridge is that because of the college system, I just had dinner with people who were historians or doing English or music or something. If you just talk to people in your own lab the whole time, then it's too much of the same thing. And so just getting a whole load of practice at engaging people in completely different fields and then learning from them, which is also good for our research, because I often get ideas by talking to people about something completely different altogether. And so if you just get used to practicing talking in general, some people kind of roll their eyes and go, oh, I hate it when people ask me about my research because there's no way I can explain it. Well, try harder. Find some way to connect with them, and then you'll also have a better friendship with them because you'll be able to talk about more things. And if you can make it interesting, then that is a start. And so when I'm writing books, I basically sit down at my computer and imagine I'm at a party talking to a friend, and then I transcribe whatever is coming out of my mouth and think about it later. So I love it when people say to me, when I read your book, I felt like I was talking to you at a party. I think, well, in that case, I did what I set out to do.
That's a great role game you can do. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Kind of related to this, someone asked, how do we as scientists and science communicators ensure that masses are enamored by ideas? So I think that it's the same issue, right? It's how do we take complex ideas and just tell the story of the ideas themselves, rather than having personalities and people and heroes surrounding those stories. And all of you can jump in, but for me, it is, I think ideas have an inherent narrative strength. There is something about the way the way science is done and the way scientific ideas come to the fore, where you can just set up ideas as things that are not yet understood, and the narrative is driven by our own inherent curiosity in wanting to understand what is not yet known, and so the narrative just becomes the unfolding of the discovery rather than who did it or the personalities involved.
Why do you love what you do? Why are you doing it? Why do you care enough to keep doing it? Convey that.
That's what I thought right now, that it's of course it's about ideas, but it's about people too, right? Because I think what our friends or people around us interest the most is why, as you said, why are you doing that? Why are you fascinated by that? And I think it's both. I think we just have to take care of showing a more a broader picture of different people to show more diversity.
So I'm really glad you said that, Anil. The fact that ideas have kind of value on their own and not necessarily related to the sort of human story behind them. I had a story. I wrote a book for. I'm twisted by a French publisher to write the book, so I wrote the book in French. And it's a book about AI. There's a little bit of autobiography, but most of it is about explaining what deep learning is all about and the limitations and the future, but really explaining, there are formulas, there are like program snippets in it and everything. And I was trying to figure out what was the best way to publish an English version of it. And I went to see a publisher in New York. Who saw the book, didn't read French, but saw there were formulas and code snippets. And he said, every formula you put in your book, you repeated the cliche, your readership goes down by a factor of 2. And, in the end, it's about people. Okay, and I said, bye-bye. So I'm actually going to publish an English version of that book with my original publisher.
So I see that we are over time for 3 minutes, but we have a full hour coffee break, so no panic, and I still see everyone listen really closely. So if there are more questions, I think we can answer one or two more.
I wanted to just address one question that a gentleman out there had brought up, that we've been talking about science as being, it has uncertainty built into it, but when it comes to scientists influencing policy, they treat whatever science has been done as normative, and then going forward it becomes this uncertain thing, or rather this certain thing. So is there something you can say about that? That how much should scientists pay attention to, when they're involved in policy decisions, etc., to convey this uncertainty in the way the policy is implemented?
I think it's very difficult in many ways, but I mean, it has to be done. But very often, because the messages that you convey as a scientist may have some nuance, and when you communicate it, it gets kind of shrunk down to basically a short quote. And so if the statement is not perfectly clear, then it's going to get, turned into a sort of black and white statement, or the opposite is going to say, no, scientists have no idea what's going on. And so it's very difficult to sort of control this complex system of, how the information gets propagated through the public. And we all, I mean, I've been victim of this early on of, communicating in ways that were kind of misinterpreted eventually. But there's another question that, which is the fact that a lot of people don't understand why we do science and why societies have to invest money, tax money, public money into research, long-term research, which is high risk, high reward, but very often inspiring, but also potentially useful in the long term. But there were like stories in the US, and there are kind of similar things in Europe where, some politician kind of looked at, some NSF-funded program and said, like, why are we funding this? This is, this seems ridiculous. And you have to explain what the process is, why you work on those sort of, admittedly kind of esoteric topic. To make progress, and unless you understand the process of science and how all the contributions feed into the progress of society, in the end, there will be sort of less public support for research, fundamental research in particular.
Yeah, I think this is really one of the main reasons why it's really important to think about that topic and to maybe even get better in communication. And this is really a motivation that's important for everyone here in the room, I guess.
I mean, people are inspired, for example, by pictures coming from the James Webb Space Telescope, as they were with the Hubble Space Telescope. And this is really kind of fundamental research, like what are the consequences on the everyday life of astronomy?
But not everyone was inspired by that.
And no, not everyone is inspired, but it's one of those things where it is, expensive, highly visible research that has inspired a lot of people, in fact.
We should also take seriously the people who are skeptical about it. Like we're saying, we need rationally skeptical. We don't need people who have absolute faith. That's not helpful. We don't need people who are completely skeptical the whole time. We need a kind of rational skepticism. And if there are questions, why are we spending money on that when there are starving children? And I think we should take those questions seriously. And if we just say, oh, we should spend money on both, I don't think that's a good enough answer, because we're not spending money on both. And why aren't we? And so all the skeptical questions, rather than just dismissing them, which I think happens too often, I think we should take them really seriously. And if we can't answer them ourselves, then we need to look more closely at our own ethics and into our souls.
I guess it depends what you mean by we. We are not spending money on.
We as a society.
It depends which country you live in.
In the end, I think it comes.
Children in every country.
I think it comes down again and again to the topic taking people seriously, enhancing diversity, and making clear that this is really for everyone. And taking their questions seriously, and of course there are the critics, and not just ask for trust and faith, because why should they? So I mean, now it's 10 minutes over time. I'm so grateful for this interesting discussions. I think we will have time to discuss more in this in-between spaces that we really have in this in-person meetings. And I'm so grateful that you all are here. And I know that I think all of you are here at least the rest of the day, and I think maybe even more days. So there will be chances to meet up in smaller groups and discuss things. But for this panel, I have to say thank you so much for joining us and for having this interesting discussion. Thank you. Applause for the panelists.